Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for being here today for the launch of Guajira, the Cuba Girl by Zita Arocha, our inaugural prize winner of the Eliud Martínez Prize. I am Katie Porter, Executive Director of Inlandia, and we are the proud publishers of this beautiful book. Today we have with us the author, Zita, and Zita is a Cuban-American journalist, writer, and educator who has reported on immigration and Latino issues for the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, and 2 afternoon dailies. She has taught bilingual journalism for nearly 20 years at the University of Texas, El Paso, where she founded and directed the award-winning web magazine Borderzine about border issues and culture. She has also served as the executive director for the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Zita Arocha. Welcome, Zita.
It's great to be here. Look forward to this day for a very long time.
Before we officially get started, I would like to invite on screen Elise Martinez, who is the widow of Eliud Martinez, the prize who we named the prize for. Eliud was very well respected locally and nationally as an author, as a scholar. So welcome, Elise.
Thank you so much. Hello, Zita. We all congratulate you. This is a very happy day for everyone. Eliud would be so happy to know that you carry on his legacy and will continue to inspire new writers. I am eager and excited to read your book and looking forward to meeting you in person. I also wish to acknowledge Duncan Webb was our dear friend, recently deceased, and his wife Gail, and thank them for establishing the award after Eliud's death. So wonderful that it's happening, and we will have a winner each year. And I'm so pleased and proud to meet you today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elise.
You're welcome.
All right. So, Zita, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about your book. What are the primary themes, and why did you embark on this journey to write this memoir?
Thank you, Katie. And before I talk about that, I just also want to acknowledge Elise and her husband. And I'm so proud that my book carries his name. And to her 2 daughters as well. Thank you so much. It's quite a privilege and an honor to be featured this way. And to Katie, actually, who's been my champion and helped me see this book from a manuscript to publication. And just so wonderful working with her and her team there at Inlandia. Very talented group of people. So thank you, Katie. You're my champion. Yeah, you really are. It was a long journey, as I said. I won't tell you how many years it took me because David, my husband, said, don't say anything about how long it took you to do this. All I will say is that it began as my MFA thesis at the University of Texas, El Paso, in their bilingual creative writing department. And so that was a while ago while I was still teaching there. And here it is today. So happy. But yeah, so the purpose of writing this memoir, everyone has a story to tell, I believe. Every life is unique, different. We all experience reality in so many different ways. And when I was growing up, my mom and dad, they were storytellers. My dad was a poet. He was a Guajiro poet. And for those of you who don't know the meaning of that word, it's a Cuban word to describe somebody from the countryside. And you may have heard the song Guajira Guantanamera. Guantanamera, Guajira, Guantanamera. My mom used to sing that all the time. That means country girl from Guantanamo. And so I consider myself a Guajira because my parents and my extended family, they were all from a little town called Guida de Melena, which is about an hour southwest of Havana. Everybody was born there, and most of my family died there. I still have family there, by the way. But because my parents were storytellers, I was a really good listener as a kid. And I heard all of their stories about their life on the farm, their life in the small town, their parents, their brothers, their sisters. And in a way, I began to collect the stories as a child, and I wanted to honor them and their reality as immigrants to America. I consider immigration to be an opportunity, but also a loss, because you leave everything you're familiar with, the people you love, the ground on which you've stood since you were born, and you're transplanted to a new place. And I think Eliud touched on those same themes, as have a lot of other writers who are immigrants. And I wanted to honor their story. I didn't want their stories to be forgotten. I wanted my family to know them, my sisters, my children. And of course, my husband knows all my stories because I've been telling him my parents' stories all these many years. That was really, I think, the primary motivation. But there was another motivation for writing this book. And it's actually, in a way, a sad thing, or I should say a hopeful thing, because I wanted to write about the trauma of immigration, the trauma of exile, what I call in the book, the karma of exile. Again, we're displaced, we're uprooted, we're replanted. We have to deal with conflicting realities, dual languages, dual cultures. Just on a very brief biographical note. So I was 4 years old when I left Cuba. My middle sister, Olga, was 2. My parents were in their late 20s, early 30s. And we left because of poverty, not because of politics. I like to clarify that, because we were poor people from the countryside. We had an opportunity to come to America because my mother's aunt had resettled in Tampa as a very young woman when she got married. And she sponsored us. She sponsored my whole family. And that to say that I was 4 when I left, and that was 1957, 2 years before the Cuban Revolution. My story also touches on the revolution because we were there that December of 1958 when Batista fled, and the Castro rebels came and took over the government, pretty much. So that was pretty traumatic. So I actually witnessed that, even though at that point we had already immigrated to Tampa. But the night, about a month and a half before we left, my grandfather, who I was very, very close to, he was an avid newspaper reader and listener. He always was in touch with what was going on in the political sphere in Cuba. And he said, my mother tells me that he once actually repeated many, many times to friends, to family, that Cuba would be the first communist country of the hemisphere of Latin America. And he was right. And this was years before the Cuban Revolution, but again, because he was so politically connected. Anyway, I was the love of his life, his first granddaughter, and I felt the same way about him. Well, he died of tuberculosis or some kind of a lung ailment at home, my grandparents' home, about a month and a half before we died. He died, and I was there at his bedside. He called to me. He wanted to talk to me before he died. And he said to me, as he lay dying, he looked at me and he said, "Don't forget us. Please come back." And therefore, I've been to Cuba for almost 20 times over the last 45 years. But the night he died, I was also in the house and someone assaulted me, and I do not know who that was. It was, I'm pretty sure, a relative. And I never saw the person's face, but I thought I was going to die because, well, I talk about it in the book. It was an incredibly traumatic event for a 4-year-old to go through the night that her grandfather dies, and asked her to promise to come back to Cuba. And then we were gone. A month and a half later, we left everyone behind, my grandparents, my other grandparents, my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles. And it was exceedingly traumatic. So frankly, I think I really write the book because I wanted other immigrants to know that and to acknowledge the pain, the trauma of exile, and in my case, the unfortunate event of being molested the night before we left. I'm sorry, the night that he died, that my grandfather died. His name was Simon. And yeah, so I think it was twofold. And the book also, Katie, goes into all of the different symptoms that I had as a child that no one knew what they were. I was a very disturbed child, and I think it was PTSD, but so twofold reason.
That makes so much sense. I mean, there's the trauma of leaving all that you know, but then that additional trauma of being assaulted as a child. So, I think as writers, we try to work through the problem through writing. So I really admire how you did that with this book and were able to cover such a complex topic: politics, personal, family. So I wanted to ask too, how is your story different from other Cuban exiles who left the island after the 1959 revolution? I imagine the trauma might have something to do with that.
Yeah, it definitely did. It did shape me as a child and then into adulthood as well. But I said this earlier, we left not because of politics, but because of poverty.
Mhm.
And many people don't know this, but there was a Cuban exodus that began in the 19th century of Cubans coming to the United States for many, many reasons. In some cases, poverty, opportunity; in other cases, because Cuba was oppressed by the Spanish, and people were fleeing the political turmoil on the island during the independence wars, for example, that Cuba was involved with in the 1900s. And there continued to be a continual immigration from Cuba all the way up and after, as everyone knows, the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And most people, when they think of Cuban immigrants or Cuban exiles, they think of the people that fled after Castro because of the communist system and the communist revolution that expropriated their land, their businesses, their farms, their livelihood, and very little, I think, understanding of the fact that no, Cubans have been coming to America for both politics and poverty for hundreds of years, for several hundred years. So it's not an unusual thing. And where my family, of course, diverges from the folks that did come right after the revolution, the 59 revolution. And by the way, as you know, this exodus continues to this day. Last year alone, over 100,000 Cubans fled Cuba, came to the United States, many through the southern border, and to escape poverty. Again, it's not just politics, but poverty. There are all kinds of challenges of living in Cuba. So, again, we were different. In that sense, we were different. But we were there in December of 1958. My mom and dad wanted to go back and see their parents again, their brothers and sisters. So we went as, believe it or not, tourists in December of 1958. We went to the little town where my family still lived, all extended family. And on December 31st of 1958, right after midnight, the new year, Batista fled the country. And when Batista fled the country, he went, by the way, with his cronies to the Dominican Republic. And it is said that he left with a lot of money and jewels, which I don't doubt. Maybe, I don't know, part of the national treasury. And so 7 days later, Fidel Castro and the rebels come in from the countryside, from the mountains where they'd been fighting the revolution, and they took power. And Castro made an incredibly moving speech from a balcony in Old Havana, in one of the hotels. And the plaza was filled with hundreds of thousands of Cubans. And at that time, most Cubans, I would say, I don't want to go into percentages, but surely more than 90% of the populace were tired of the corrupt regime of Fulgencio Batista, the killings of young people, protesters, and they believed that this was the way. This was the way to a free Cuba, by getting rid of Batista. Just a little aside, a little story. That night, December 31st, no, actually, by this point, it was after midnight. So it was the 1st of January, 1959, middle of the night. We were at my aunt's house in a suburb of Havana called Guanabacoa. And there was an explosion, huge explosion that just rocked the whole neighborhood. My mom was tossed off the bed by the powerful blast. Everyone in the neighborhood ran out into the street. They didn't know what was happening. People were screaming, yelling, whatever. Well, the next morning, lo and behold, on the airwaves is the story of Batista's departure and the coming of the rebels to Havana to take over the government. So then it became a day of celebration. But I never knew what caused, I never, ever knew, my family never knew what caused that explosion. And then on a trip with my husband, David, the first time he went to Cuba, which was probably almost 20 years ago, we had the wherewithal and the luck to look at the newspaper archives of those days in January, early days of January 1959, and there it was on the front page of the newspaper, of Diario La Marina. 10,000 tons of explosives, blow out Guanabacoa, okay? And what had happened was that the soldiers, Batista soldiers who remained at the armory that was in that neighborhood, they blew it up when they found out that Batista had fled, and that the rebels were coming down to the city. They didn't want the rebels to have all the weapons and whatnot, so they blew it all up. And so there I was, many, many years later, finally shedding light on this very traumatic event that night of the 1st of January.
Yeah. In fact, I think there were a couple of pictures from that, from the newspaper. Do you mind if I share those?
Please do, please do.
Okay, pull those up real quick. Is it this one? And
yeah, there you go at the very bottom. There you go, 1,000 pounds of dynamite.
wow. I know the story of your going in and being able to look at the papers is in the book, and that was quite harrowing.
That was quite harrowing. We had to bribe the lady to let us look at the newspapers, the librarian, yep, but it was a good investment.
So you're a journalist by trade. So what process did you use to write the memoir? Did your training as a journalist help you with that?
Well, even before I became a journalist, which is when I graduated from college, University of South Florida in Tampa, I was already a journalist because I think, like what I said before, was I was always collecting stories. I was always collecting family stories, and that's what journalists do. They listen, right? They listen. And those stories, my parents' stories, are in the book. When I decided that I wanted to pursue an MFA, Master of Fine Arts, and what my thesis was going to be, I decided that it needed to be a memoir. And writing a memoir is completely different from writing either fiction or journalism, news stories. Very, very different. And so one of the things I had to overcome as I was writing the memoir, I had to overcome the tendency to explain, right? To explain things, because that's what journalists do, and include details that were extraneous to the story. So I had to really kind of fight my inner urge to do that. And the other thing I had to do, I had to learn that it wasn't just telling all of these stories of a life and of my parents' lives, but it was also about reflecting on what they meant and how they fit into the greater story, the greater arc of my life as an immigrant child. And so the journalism definitely came in very, very handy because I knew how to listen. I did a lot of recordings of my family in Cuba over the years, over the many visits that I made there. So that helped a tremendous amount. I already had the material, and I have an incredible memory. And it's amazing that as a 4-year-old, I have crisper memories of Cuba and what was happening in my hometown than my relatives who are still there. It's amazing to me. And I've asked them, when I ask them, what about this? How did this happen? They tell, you know what they say? They say, I don't remember. I don't remember. And it's like I'm filling in the gaps for them, which is amazing.
I think sometimes with that, it's all about the questions that help people remember. If you ask something general, that's not going to elicit the kind of response that you want. I think being a journalist, you know what questions to ask.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So there's a lot about, I guess maybe the most surprising part about this was that it starts in a Buddhist retreat, and there's a lot of talk about karma, and also the trauma of exile. So can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. This starts the Buddhist, the book, by the way, begins the prologue and the epilogue. They're bookends for the book. And they start at Taramandala, which is a retreat center, a Tibetan Buddhist retreat center in southern Colorado. And they end at a different retreat many, many years later when the book's finished. But I was introduced to Buddhism by one of my daughters, Miranda, my youngest daughter, who is actually studying Tibetan Buddhist religion as part of a PhD at Northwestern University. And she went there her senior year, I believe, of her undergraduate studies. She was doing a paper on American women in Buddhism. And so my husband and I drove her there from where we live in southern New Mexico, and we dropped her off in the woods under a tent. There were no buildings on the land then, and to spend the summer there. And so I became really curious about what is this? What is my daughter studying? And I began to go to different retreats there, learn about the practices. And the woman who actually established Taramandala, she's an American woman who was a nun in Tibet when she was in her early 20s. And she then created this retreat center in southern Colorado. And by the way, this is funny, the family fortune becomes from a small family newspaper, okay? There are all of these newspaper things connected here. So I start going to retreats. I get more and more interested in it. I learn a practice that that the founder started to help people deal with their trauma. It's called feeding your demons. I began to do that practice. I don't go into it too much in the book of what it is, because it's complicated and you really have to be interested in it to really want to know about it. But it began to really help me see my story, see my, like, again, the larger arc of my life and what it meant and what my immigrant experiences meant. And so I continued to go there, and I began really seriously writing the book in the prologue on a retreat when I was there for a whole month to meditate, to do a lot of reading, to just be by myself, be quiet, take photographs, and write. And then, as I said, I finish it many years later at another retreat there. So I thank my daughter for introducing me to the practice. You know, I call myself a Christian Buddhist, and I won't go into it. I was raised as an evangelical Christian, and I was very grateful to the church because it was a Spanish-speaking church for immigrants. And the church became our family in exile. It was really an anchor in our little community of West Tampa. So as I said, I consider myself both a Christian and a Buddhist.
Wow. You know, I was wondering if you might want to read a little something from the book.
Yes.
I think it'd be good for our viewers to get a taste.
Yes, I'd love to do that. And there's so much in it. I hope those of you that are interested get a chance to read the whole thing. My sisters have read it and they both told me that they really loved it. And actually they helped me fill in some gaps in the story of memory. So I was very, very grateful to them. But one of the stories I like best is the story of what it was that prompted my mom, who was a feisty little lady. They say in Spanish, no tenía pelos en la lengua, which means that in English that she never held back her tongue. She always said what she thought, even though people didn't like it. She was a little firebrand. She was the motivator for our leaving Cuba. So I like this story because it tells you a little bit about her personality and how she got us out of Cuba. Okay, so here goes. After she married Dad, my mother scanned her bleak horizon. A rented wood frame, leaky, cockroach-infested Bajareque. Dad's $1-a-day salary hauling sugarcane and pineapples to far corners of the island for a rich hacendado, their mushrooming debt to the grocer, and her embarrassment each time her older sister brought over food and gave her money for clothes and shoes for her young daughters. Nos vamos de este país de mierda, she announced one day to Dad, who was covered in dirt from a 3-day work trip to Pinar del Rio. We're leaving this shithole. Shocked by Olga's strong language and the lightning flashes in her blue eyes, Dad stared at the floor and took a slow sip of water from the glass she handed him. We're not going anywhere, he said, slammed the water glass on the table and marched out the front door. Sorry, I have to turn the page. Aquí me muero, he said. I will die here. That's what you think, Mom called after him and sat down at the kitchen table to write to Carmen, her widowed aunt who lived in Tampa, asking for help to leave. 18 months later, my parents appeared on the wood steps of her West Tampa rooming house with 2 battered suitcases and my 2-year-old sister in tow. So that was her. And I go a little bit more in a different part of the book into um, that actually before all of us left together, my mother said to my dad, Aunt Carmen is willing to sponsor you to go first, establish a beachhead in Tampa, get a job, illegally, of course, because he didn't have any work papers, and maybe rent us a little place, get a steady job, come back, pick us up, and take us to Tampa. And so my dad reluctantly decided that he would do that. Mom was so insistent. And it was a disaster. And I tell the story in the book. I don't want to read it now because it's kind of long, but so he gets to Aunt Carmen's rooming house on Armenia Avenue in West Tampa. And her husband, Aunt Carmen, had been a barber. And so they made a pretty good living, and they owned this rooming house in front of the cigar factory in West Tampa. Tampa's known for its Cuban cigars back then in the 19th century. Puros, they called them, pure, puros. And so Dad gets there. My aunt, who was also very feisty, opinionated, hard-headed, and she hated men. She absolutely hated men. You'll have to read the book to find out why this was. She took an immediate dislike to my father. And so like he would take a shower and he would hear her in the kitchen, because it was next to the bathroom. He would hear in the kitchen Carmen muttering under her breath, Guajiro, asqueroso, muerto de hambre, which means, Guajiro, I told you all what that means. Muerto de hambre, half-starving peasant, no good, unworthy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he didn't know who she was talking about. The minute that he left the bathroom after his shower, she would go in there with a big pail of water, a jug of Clorox, and she would wipe down the entire bathroom. Okay, so that was his welcome from dear old Aunt Carmen. A younger uncle actually was already living there and had gotten a job. She had sponsored him too. So Dad got a job at a glass factory. He didn't have papers. He was there working illegally. And he cut his hand on a piece of glass. So he got injured. And then a couple days later, immigration comes to the glass factory and asks all the workers for their papers. And dad lied and said, oh, they're at home. I'm so sorry. I didn't bring them. And he goes back to Aunt Carmen's and he says, I'm leaving. I'm going back and I'm never coming back to Tampa. And from there, of course, begins, my mom was shocked. And then he went into a deep, deep, deep depression because of everything that had happened to him. And my mother wouldn't talk to him and he took to bed. Anyway, so then it's stories in the book. Mom talks him into leaving again, and he does so reluctantly. And the rest is history.
Such a horrible welcome from family. Lack of welcome.
Oh gosh. And Carmen was a trip.
All right. So I'm curious too. You write about being caught up in some espionage or, watched by government agents. It sounds all very something out of the movies. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it totally is, Katie. It totally is. And I should have known. The Cubans are master spies. They learned all their tricks from the Russians. And I'm not kidding. There's a huge building. I think it's a surveillance building that belongs to Russia on the outskirts of Havana. And there are rumors, speculation that those sound attacks against American diplomats in Havana, I don't know if y'all have heard about those, but that's where they came from.
Oh.
the spy facility on the outskirts of Havana. So yeah, so I start going back, and I the first time I went back, I went as a journalist. And the first time I went back, yeah, that was a trip to pick up some political prisoners. So it was an overnight. I went on an empty plane with the organizers to Havana, spent the night, and then picked up, I think it was 35 to 40 political prisoners and their families, and brought them back to Miami. That was the first trip. Then I went back with my mom and dad, their first time back. And the one and only time my father ever went back. He refused to go back to a communist country. And the tower, yes, the tower. The tower, it's there, still there, all these years later. They may even have satellites, who knows? I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, it's very typical. Anybody who's been to Cuba, you know, it is a police state, so to speak. It's like Russia. People are watched, people are spied upon, people are listened to. Whenever I stayed in a hotel with my mom, I'd pick up the phone and you could hear the crackling in the back. I mean, they were very sophisticated. I once I once arranged to meet with, this was a later trip with my with some dissident journalists. I was intent on, and this is a while ago, maybe 20 some years ago. I wanted to interview them. I made an arrangement to on the phone at the hotel. There were no cell phones, to go meet them one night. Well, that night, Mom and I were eating in the dining room. We were getting ready to leave to go meet with these folks. And guess who shows up? My handler. My handler, who had met me at the beginning of my trip, who said he was a journalist for the Cuban news service, became my buddy, so to speak, gave Mom and me, this was amazing, I still have them, 2 of the old issues of the Bohemia magazine, which was the primary pre-Batista magazine, news magazine before the revolution. He gave that to us as a gift. Anyway, so he shows up just as we're drinking coffee and finishing dinner, and he starts talking and talking and talking. And I'm looking at my clock, my watch, right? I got to go to this meeting. I got to go to this meeting. Finally, I say, look, I've got to go to sleep. I'm tired. Mom had already gone upstairs to go to sleep. And I said, anyway, I was so paranoid. I immediately called the people I was going to meet with, and I said, I don't think it's a good idea. I didn't want to give away their location, you know, whatever, although I'm sure that that the secret police already knew where these people were. And I just asked, and I asked them, I said, let's do this in public. I said, come to the hotel tomorrow. We'll sit in the lobby, and I'll talk with you there. And so we left it that way. But before my handler left, because I said I was going to sleep, I asked him, I looked him straight in the eye, because I knew it was a stalling tactic. He was trying to get me not to go. He were telling me in not so many words, don't go, don't go. And so I looked him in the eye and I said, and I don't even remember his name. And I said, listen, I'd like you to level with me. I have plans to meet with some dissident journalists. I didn't say when or where. I said, if I do that, am I going to get in trouble with the government? And he was startled. I don't think he believed that I had asked that, okay? And he looked at me and he shook his head. And that's when I said, good night, I'm going upstairs to sleep. And then I made the arrangement for the next day. That was one of many, many adventures, you know. Weird things happened, like when David and I were there in 2020? I can't remember. It was his first time there. We were walking from our hotel to an ice cream shop in downtown Havana. And on the way back to our hotel in Vedado, the security guard comes out of the shadows. and starts talking to us, real friendly. Cubans are very friendly. You know, we talk with our hands. We're very expressive. And nice young guy. He couldn't have been older than 25. And he comes up to us, we chit chat. How are you? Where are you going? Blah, blah, blah. Tell him, oh, to the hotel. Who are you? Where are you from? Oh, we're from El Paso, the US-Mexico border. The guy starts telling me the names of journalists who work in El Paso that we knew, journalists in Ciudad Juarez who we knew, all kinds of things about our hometown. And I said to him, how do you know this? How do you know all these things? Oh, he says, I have access to a computer. Okay. Well, everything's monitored there. And that's another one of many, many examples. Another time, I have to tell you this story, it's in the book. I'm in Miami, Little Havana at La Carreta. Well, some of my friends here who worked in Miami know La Carreta. And I'm having lunch with the federal prosecutor whose job was to prosecute people who had been, who had flown planes illegally from Cuba to Miami. And, you know, in other words, presumed spies, whatever. And I'm sitting there with him. Again, we're drinking a cafecito, and very collegial. He was telling me about his cases and this and that and the other, asking questions. And out of the blue, he says to me again, he looks at me straight in the eye and he says, were you ever photographed in a compromising position with a Cuban agent? And I said, what? He said, yeah, you know, photographed. I said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? He says, there is a photograph of you with a top level DGI agent, that's what they call them, in a public place in Havana. And it's with the Federal Department of Law Enforcement. So well, I knew what happened. And I don't think I'll tell you the story. You got to read it to know my figuring. I was already married at the time. Not only that, but that was the trip that I took with my parents, mom and dad. They were in the hotel waiting for me as I was dancing with a Cuban agent at Tropicana. Little did I know, the guy said he was a tourism official. Okay. So yeah, so stories, you know, but if you go there, and I tell people, you got to go, you got to experience it. It's an amazing place. Yes, the government is watching you and listening, making sure you're not going to be an evildoer with good reason, right? There have been so many attacks by extremist right-wing Cubans. You all may remember the blowing up of the Cubana airline that killed the entire Cuban soccer team returning from Latin America. And it was the culprit was a guy who was later a terrorist, had done similar attacks. So Cuba has always felt under attack by the right wing and by the CIA. And the CIA tried to poison Castro at least 20 times. It's been written about. You know, so there is an understanding as to why the Cubans are paranoid, and that they tend to be very careful of the people who do come into the country. But if you're there and you aren't there for a nefarious reason, you're safe. Nobody's going to bother you. They will watch you and they will listen to you. But it is a perfectly safe place, and it's worth experiencing. Most of us who have never lived in a communist country, what that's like and how the people survive, and the people are wonderful. I still have my whole extended family is in that same little town. You know, my God, I've got dozens and dozens of cousins, and my two sisters, Olga and Barbara, the three of us are planning a trip there to visit our family. They've never been. Olga never went back after she left at 2 years old. Barbara has never been back, has never gone. She was born in the United States. And so we'll be fine. Although I gave a talk recently here in Las Cruces where I live, and one of the ladies in the audience said, "You better be careful." And I said, "I just want to see my family, that's all, you know." So,
It's good you've been able to go back so many times and that you'll take your sisters.
yes.
I wondered, I know on an occasion of an interview with a high school history teacher
Yes.
that did not turn out so well. Do you want to tell us a little bit?
Yeah, that is one of the lowest points, I think, in my journalistic career. And it was unintentional. I mean, maybe that's an excuse, but I had no idea how this was going to turn out. So yeah, I can't use his name. He asked me never use his name. Actually didn't want me to tell his story, but so many years later, I felt okay telling the story without the name. So on another trip to my hometown, my mom went with me this time. A relative says to me, and this was in the early, trying to think of the days, in the early 90s. Okay, this was when, no, it wasn't the special period hadn't happened yet. But anyway, so a relative comes up and says to me, I have a friend. He's a teacher at the local high school, and he really wants to meet you. He wants to talk with you. And I said, sure, yeah, why not, right? I was not technically there as a journalist. I was really there to visit family. And so he comes to the house. This is the same house where my grandmother and grandfather, that was their house. It's still there. The family still lives there. And I sit in the living room. Somebody in the family closed all the shutters, locked the door, right? So we were kind of sitting in the dark on armchairs, on rocking chairs, sitting across from Maestro. And he starts telling me, look, I teach history at the local high school. This is the type of history that I'm allowed to teach. And he was telling me about that basically he was only allowed to teach about the revolution and how wonderful it was. And yeah, and he started telling me all of these other things that he found problematic about the revolution and the direction that the country was going in, and the propaganda, and how the government was basically trying to brainwash the kids into accepting the communist ideology. And I sat with him about an hour and a half. I did take notes, my little skinny notebook, and he left. And I went back to Miami, and I said, I'm not going to publish anything this man said to me. He would get him in trouble, right? And so fast forward 2 years, I go back to Cuba again with my mother to visit family. And a neighbor has a letter for me. And I go and pick up the letter. And the letter was from Maestro. And he tells me what happened to him the Monday after the interview, when he showed up to his classroom. And he said that there were 2 security people waiting for him. They didn't let him go inside the classroom. They took him into a sealed room in the school building. They sat down with him. They said, we know about your conversation with an American journalist. This is everything you said to her. And they read it all off. And they said, you are a counter-revolutionary. You don't belong here. You don't belong as part of the revolution. And we are stripping you of your teaching credentials. You will never, ever teach in Cuba again. So he lost his job, and he ended up, in those days, most employment in Cuba was from the Cuban government. The job he gave him was tending pigsties. And it was amazing. The man's life was destroyed. So in this letter he sends me, he tells me all this. I was devastated. I had no idea who had had revealed our conversation to the government, right? So I did meet with him. He was living in Havana at that time. I talked to him. I tried to help him. He wanted me to help him leave the country. I said I would. I gave him some money to help him and his family out. Needless to say, I did what I could to try to get him out through a Republican congresswoman from Miami. She told me she couldn't do anything for him because he was not in prison. If they had thrown him in prison, they would have tried to get him out. And the man's life was destroyed. The man's life was destroyed. So yeah, that was, and again, it was unintentional. And the entire story is in the book. Yeah, because he continued to communicate with me to try to get me to help him get out of Cuba. I don't know if he's alive today. I don't know. Yeah.
That's such a terrifying anecdote about the power of censorship. I mean, it actually is reminiscent of things that are going on today, even in this country. So I wanted to open it up a little bit for questions. If anybody in the audience, raise your hand if you would like to ask Zita anything about her experience or from the book. Please use the raise your hand function, because I don't know that I will see you actually physically raise your hand. Do we have any questions? Okay, Janet, go ahead and unmute.
Hey, Zita. I think David's on, the whole Soto family. Hi to everybody, Smith. And likewise, journalism to creative writing. Could you have done this book without doing your MFA? I mean, there's such a dramatic switch. That's what the process. If you could just talk about your book is all about transitions. If you could talk about the transition in your life as a writer. And how you came to write this.
Yeah, I think I said earlier that I didn't want my parents' stories to be lost. I didn't want their story of growing up in a Batista era government to be lost, and what it was like to be in the countryside, which was so different from the experience of people from Havana. But first of all, I've had friends who say to me, when I was a journalist, I would work sometimes 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I believed in the power of journalism to change lives and to reveal things that people didn't want to know. And I wrote a lot about, for example, migrant farm workers south of Tampa when I worked at the newspaper there. And so that training and my overwork, my daughter tells me all the time, my younger daughter, Mom, you're a workaholic, and I say, you're right. I just devoted my whole life to telling stories, to writing people's stories, to uncovering stuff that wasn't right, things I considered to be not right in our society. And so again, it was in the back of my mind. Yeah, someday maybe I'll write a memoir. Yeah, maybe. And I had an editor once who said to me, this was at the Miami Herald. I have my friend Janet, who I worked with there, is in on the call today. Hi, Janet.
Yeah, I can guess who the editor was.
You can't. Okay, you know who the editor was. Yeah, don't tell anybody, or do tell him. I don't care. I don't even know if he's alive anymore. But I went into his office because I had been writing story after story after story in the Spanish newspaper. I taught myself how to report and write in Spanish, which is another amazing thing. It was really hard. And the English paper assigned a team of reporters to do the definitive story about travel to Cuba, about exiles being allowed finally after 20 some years to return to the island. I had been covering that story by story by story, the opening of travel agencies, the bombing of the supposed alleged, not, it wasn't even alleged, they put a bomb, somebody put a bomb on the sidewalk of a bank that was run by a Cuban exile who had gone back to talk to Castro. Okay, that was how vitriolic. I was writing all these stories, and I wasn't selected for the reporting team. And I thought, what the heck? I'm the one who's been reporting all these stories. I've got all the sources. And I went into his office and I said, I won't tell you his name. I don't understand why I can't be on this project. This is my story. And he looked at me and he said, Zita, you have to realize that a journalist whose first language is not English can never write as well as somebody born in the United States. That's what the guy said to me. And that's how he kept me off the story. I wasn't allowed to be part of that story. And I think that that was my motivation to actually write a memoir, because I said, damn it, I'm going to tell my story. And maybe I should actually thank him for having been the motivation of me to say, I'm going to learn how to do this. I've never done this before. It's a totally different type of writing, but I don't want the stories to be lost in time and in history. So I would say, and you know what, any journalist who is intending to write, especially a memoir, I think it's easier if you just go right straight into fiction or even poetry. But if you're intending to write a memoir, it's a totally different style of writing. There are all kinds of considerations you have to take, including what names you're going to reveal, what incidents you're going to reveal, and how you're going to protect people, right? It's not on the record necessarily. And I would recommend that people get an MFA and do that. And there are online MFAs now. That UTEP, where I got my MFA in bilingual creative writing, also has a program. And I see one of my professors who is the advisor on my memoir and helped me shape it and gave me the building blocks for the bookends that I used to tell my story. Lex Williford, he's here. I couldn't have done it without it. I could not have done it. And I was working full time. And like I said, I'm a maniac. You know, I am a workaholic, and I was teaching full time the whole time that I was doing and I love my students. And I also tend to give my all to my students because they have stories to tell and they're the future of journalism. That's how I see it. That's a great question. Thank you.
We have 2 more hands up and 1 more minute in our program. So I think we can go a little over unless if anybody has to go ahead and step out, but we'll keep going. So Hillary, I see you have a question.
Yes, I was wondering if there's a favorite, or what your favorite part of the book is as far as the writing process. Like, what did you have the most fun writing?
Oh, that's a great question. So 2 things. The chapter about when I was a kid and had all of these PTSD symptoms, and my parents had no idea what was going on with me, and we had no clue about psychology. They had no clue about who a psychologist was or how to help their kid. And she took me to go see a Babalao. A Babalao is a Cuban witch doctor who does ritual cleansings and sometimes curses and things like that. And my 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who was Cuban like us, during a parent-teacher conference with my mom, suggested that she take me to see a Babalao. And I had so much fun with that part of the book, of her taking me there, not telling my father, of having him have me strip. I was 10 years old. I was terrified. I didn't know what was going on. And that was so much fun, Hillary. Yeah, that. And the other, I think, is where I talk about, another incident. This was more like free writing, and an incident when I was a little baby there's a lot of racism still in Cuba. There certainly was a lot of it back in the Batista years. My mom, I was a little infant. I was 6 months old. She takes me to a verbena, which was a little country dance in the dance hall in the little town. And there were two Black women. The Blacks were not allowed in the dance hall. They had their separate dance hall back then. And these two women, and this is my mother's story. I mean, I was 6 months old. How could I know? They're looking through the window and they're staring, and they see my mother walk in with me, and my mom dressed me as a doll. She took a little dress and a little bonnet from a doll. She put it on me. And the two women at the window call my mother over, and they're arguing about, it's a doll. No, it's a baby. No, it's a doll. No, it's a baby. And I had a lot of fun with that little episode that's in the book. And again, I'm grateful to my mom for that anecdote.
So, Francis, do you want to ask? You're on mute. Francis.
Okay.
There you go.
Congratulations, Zita. I'm so looking forward to reading your book, and I am enjoying your talk. And I want to ask you about your grandfather's wishes at his deathbed when you were 4 years old. Is that your primary reason for returning to Cuba 20 times already and being a journalist?
That's a great question. And I've asked myself that a lot. Think about it. Here's a 4-year-old, the grandfather's dying, and he says, don't leave us, come back. I mean, man, that's been with me my whole life. And yeah, I think that was a motivation to go back. But the other thing about it is that I love my culture. I love Spanish. I love the foliage there, the trees, the fruits, my family there, and I couldn't let them go. And actually I still support them. My husband and I support them financially and in the way that we can. Yeah. And I can't let them go. I can't. So I think it's for both those reasons. Yeah, sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
Janet.
Okay, Zita, it's lovely. I'm not completely through it, but I didn't know all this about you, particularly that you were such a nutty child. But I think your next book should be about the border crisis. And I'd like your insight. So we'll have to get together over drinks and learn that. But so much of what you're talking about,
Yeah.
the people coming across the border must be facing.
Yeah.
And how do we deal with that going forward?
Absolutely, Janet. Yes, you're so right. And I saw an interview that Amna Nawaz did. She's on the PBS NewsHour. 3 little girls were brought to the border, 11 years old, 8 years old, 12 years old, 8 years old, and a 7-year-old, I think. Their mother had them smuggled to the border to be reunited with her. And I can only imagine the kind of trauma. And I actually listened to a program yesterday by a major immigration think tank. They did a discussion about trauma in immigrant children. These children are going to be traumatized for life. The things that they've seen, both in their home countries and during the crossing, is unbelievable. Never mind then when they get to our country and have to acclimate. And I don't know if I said this in the book, but when I started first grade, I did not speak a word of English. And the teacher, was Mrs. Moore, and the kids were all English speaking. And for the first 6 months of first grade, I did not speak because I did not want them to find out that I didn't understand what was going on. I pretended to understand. I never spoke. And think about all of these kids now coming over, becoming, and for all all countries. It's not just Cuba or Mexico or Guatemala. You know, we're talking about kids from all over the world. And so, yeah, it is, you've got a point. And I'd love to sit down with you and get your input, Janet, on how I might be able to frame that story so that it
Oh,
does.
well, I won't take up more time, but we'll talk about that. But I do think at least you had a welcoming community in
Yes.
Tampa. You had the church. These children, given the politics of our country and the antipathy of having immigrants, there's such resentment that I think you're right. The trauma will be much worse than even what you went through. But think about it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I can't wait to have coffee with you or wine. Thank you. Yep. And thank you, Katie. And thank you, Elise. Again, I don't think this book would have come to light if you hadn't believed in it. If the judge who judged the entries had not believed in the value of this work. So thank you so much. It's been so great working with you.
Oh, thank you, Zita, for trusting us with your work. And I know Alex Espinoza, he was the judge, and he was very sorry. He was originally planned to be here today and had a family emergency to tend to. And I did see we had one other hand in the audience, but I'm afraid I think we're out of time. But I just want to thank everybody for being here today and for supporting this beautiful book and this beautiful author. And we couldn't be more thrilled. So we hope to see you all again. If you are in the Southern California area, please do drop in. We will be hosting another event in person in July 14th. If you do not already have a copy of Guajira, you can pick it up from virtually in any bookseller, including Barnes & Noble and Amazon, as well as through our Inlandia bookstore. And we will see each other again soon. So be
Thank
well.
you all for listening.
Yes.
Bye, Zita,
Thank
te
you.
queremos mucho.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Chao.
Love you, Zita. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay.
Felicidades, querida
Great
Zita.
job.
Congratulations.
Felicidades.
Congratulations.
Bye-bye.
Love you.
Wonderful.
Adios.